So here's our release. That simply fits in the body here. I'll put a wipe of molybdenum paste on the underside surface of that. And some through the hole. That's where the shoulder screw, it pivots on that screw, which is a shoulder screw, so that needs to pivot smoothly. And see if we can get this post screwed back into position. Make sure that that shoulder goes through the bracket and the arm doesn't get caught. Alright, that action's nice and smooth. We had the mystery spring, the spring that I thought that had got away that hadn't, here. Now I've got to hook that back into position on that arm. Which is probably going to be one of those tasks that's not as easy as it sounds. Ooh, it's playing hard to get. I might need 2 pairs of tweezers. I might even have to resort to taking the arm off, hooking the spring on and then putting the arm back in place. And that was the solution. Alright, that's nicely sprung loaded, everything moves smoothly. There was a little bracket that held that lever to stop it getting away or flapping. Let's put a touch of molybdenum paste under the contacting surfaces there. And there are just 2 small screws that hold that in position. That's the first one. This screw head's a little bit damaged looking, just means that someone's been at it with a screwdriver which was probably too small to do the job. Just make sure that's sitting nice and even. tighten those two screws up. As our shutter release moves nice and smoothly. And that is pretty much it for that. I could put the earth wire on there for the flash contact, but that's about it. So our focus there is all nice and smooth. Now that's all ready to have the shutter put back on, but of course I'm not at that stage yet because I haven't serviced the shutter. So we'll stop right here and I'll do the shutter. So this shutter, well, let's have a look. We'll blow some of that dust off the back of that rear lens group. That's very dusty and it's got a lot of dust on the inside too. That'll just unscrew with my fingers. That we can go to one side. Just carefully making sure that the glass surface is well recessed before I put that down. Now this cover, will that lift off? Yes it will. I can slide that off the arm. Now this little coupling here, that's for cocking the shutter. That's got a D-shaped hole in it. It's probably just pressed onto that shaft. I'm just taking note of how much space there is underneath that so that I don't press it back down too far when I put it back together. Obviously it'll need to be pressed on there firmly, otherwise it would want to rattle about. See if that'll lift off. Yep, that just slid on. What am I looking at here? That lever, that's our release. And the other was for the cocking action. Now this release lever here, is that pressed onto the shaft? It looks like it. Let's get another screwdriver, see if I can lever that either side and lift that off. Yep, it's coming off. Okay, again that's also got a little D-shaped hole in it, couples to that shaft. The front group should just screw in. I wouldn't expect it to be much of a fight, but it certainly wants to. Okay, and if to try that with a friction tool, and failing that I'll need something else. That does not want to move. So I've got to find what tool I've got which will grasp this front lens group from the outside so I can unscrew it. I've got this spanner that was made for working on a retina, probably a 3C, when I needed to be able to get the lens off that somebody had twisted on there in the wrong position. It's very tight on here. I've got to open that slot up slightly to spread it enough. That's better. So now it's on there. Actually that's quite tight. So I might need to put a glove on so I can get a good enough grip on. No, there we go. It's free now. That was all that was required. Very annoying getting lenses like that loose. As soon as they move the tiniest amount, they can be absolutely loose. You wonder what all the fighting was about. Let's put that lens down carefully. Again, I'm making sure that the front surface doesn't stick out proud before I put that lens down. And here we have the shutter. Now this shutter has definitely been serviced before. It shows all the hallmarks. And I'll show you what I mean here if I zoom in. here's our little lock screw, and you'll notice there's scratches and marks at each of those 3 positions. That's where somebody has unscrewed that by poking at it with the tip of their tweezers or with the end of a screwdriver. And they've slipped every time and they've left scars in there. So obviously there's been a bit of bad practice going on there. In the front of the mount here, around where the lens sits, I can see a lot of dust and grit. Well, of course that goes along with this sort of filth that I'm seeing in the back of that, which is also pretty nasty. So the camera has definitely been out in dusty, gritty conditions, probably down to the beach, something like that. I mean, whoever takes a camera to the beach. So first to remove the lock screw. That's a little bit brown. I can't immediately tell whether that's corrosion or it's just dirt. And we want a toothpick to unscrew the retaining ring so that we don't leave scars like the last person. This is quite stiff. It's got a gritty sort of a feel to it. Oops, I wasn't intending it to fall to bits quite so quickly. Here's our retaining ring. The front cover plate, this has got the detents on it for our shutter speeds. This is the shutter speed settings ring, and it couples to the shutter speed settings cam plate with those notches. This is our aperture settings here on this piece. There's the shutter speed settings cam plate and the shutter itself. Now this shutter is, for all practical purposes, the same as you'd strike in a Retina 3C type camera. There should be no great surprises here. The shutter release lever is probably a bit different, but otherwise there's nothing exciting there. This should be simple enough to service. So this internal cocking ring here, we'll have that off. Now let's have this off first. That's the lever that stops you being able to press the shutter release if the shutter's not cocked. That will come off its post. Here's the little pinion that cocks the shutter. Here's the main drive spring for the shutter. We can lift that out. I'm interested in the state of that. Yeah, it's a bit tired. When these are new, if you take that top tab as being 12, this should sit at about 2 o'clock. This one's sitting at about 3 o'clock. That's not terrible. This is the main drive cam for the shutter. That can come out. Our shutter release lever, I'm just looking at this to make sure I'm aware of which way round the spring sits. And the return spring sits in against the edge of the case here. Some shutters the spring might be on the other side of the post here, but they're not. So that's good. If you put it in the wrong place, you end up with a spring that doesn't have enough tension to do its job, or you'll end up with a spring that's damaged because it's been pushed beyond its limits. So it's always worth noting exactly where that spring was tucked down. Here's the retard gear train, 2 screws, and this will want to be flushed carefully in naphtha, and I'll put that through the ultrasonic cleaner to do that job because I'm lazy, and it does a wonderful job. Single screw holds the retard self-timer in place. Likewise, that can go through the ultrasonic cleaner. These parts. Right, so I'll just cock that, which allows this arm to drop down. I'll unhook that spring so that it's not under tension, and so it doesn't want to fly off across the room as soon as it has an opportunity. 2 screws. And the spring. Just lift it off with it. The cover plate. Got to make sure that arm moves nice and freely, otherwise it won't hold the shuttlecock correctly. Flash contact. Just release that mechanism, and this little lever is a spring loading part for the flash sync mechanism. We'll get that off. I've got to unhook this spring, so I need a pair of pliers. So I want to put a screwdriver behind this arm so it doesn't move. While I grab that spring, stretch it out, unhook it, and that all goes nice and smoothly. If you don't put something behind the arm to stop it swinging, you'll find that as you stretch the spring out, the arm's moving away with it, and you stretch things out forever. We'll get that little pinion wheel off there. That's the pallet wheel. Have that off. There's a spring here, easily lost. So I'm holding a toothpick over the shaft so it can't get away. I'll unhook that spring carefully and then lift it out of the shutter. They're easily lost, and I'm always struggling to find a spare if I'm silly enough to lose one. So they're quite commonly gone. I'll get that. That's the B lever. We'll have that out. Here's the spring, the return spring for the B lever. We'll have that out. Nothing else from the top of the shutter. At the back of the shutter, see little patches of corrosion here. 3 screws hold this bracket in place. Now this is the aperture setting lever. This swings our diaphragm blades inwards or outwards. I'll pop these screws to one side, lift that plate off. This shim here obviously has got a bit of corrosion on it. Well, it looks quite ugly on that side. This lever should come off. That sets our flash sync speeds and our self timer. Now we're down to the shutter case. You can see there's a bit of corrosion here. This camera has obviously been to the beach and it's been damp. So perhaps splashed at the beach or in the spray, something like that. Or packed away with a wet towel after someone's been out for a swim. Something of that nature. Right, off with the case. Here we have the shutter case with the diaphragm in it. Just checking the movement of that. It moves freely enough. Certainly going to need to do some cleaning on that case. And the mechanism plate here with the shutter blades. The shutter blades are quite good. They don't appear to be stuck together with oil, which of course is common for shutters. The mechanism plate itself here, we've got 3 screws hold the lens tube in place, and the lens tube holds the blade actuating ring in place. This screw here is longer than its mates because it also holds this little bracket in place for the main drive spring. Here's the lens tube off, and here's the blade actuating ring. Let's back to the case. There's a little peg on the back of this shutter, that's to align it in the camera body and stop it rotating. That can make, you just want to make sure you don't lose it. So we've got 3 screws hold this plate in position, and this retaining plate will hold the 5 diaphragm blades in position. So there's the moving plate, the one that couples to the settings lever. It's a little bit grimy. There are 5 diaphragm blades which are busy trying to get away. They're a little bit grimy. There's a hint that they're not exceptionally flat, which would normally be a sign that at some stage in their life they've been covered in oil and so were stuck together, and then when you push the settings lever something wants to give. Okay, all of these pieces have got to be cleaned. Now the insulator here on this plastic, on the flash contact, that plastic's a bit peeled away. I have to be sure that's not going to contact the settings lever, otherwise I'll have to cut that plastic off and put a bit of heat shrink over that instead. Alright, so these pieces all need to be cleaned, ready for reassembly. Generally it's enough to clean these surfaces with a bit of naphtha on a cotton bud, but you can see that there's corrosion products there which I'm scraping off so that they don't prevent things from moving smoothly. And when I see that sort of stuff I immediately think that salt water was involved. And that little recess where the screw sits, there was corrosion there. There's no serious problem there in terms of strength for the shutter casing. We just don't want lumps and bumps causing anything to be unduly stiff in its movements. We want everything to move smoothly. And these are the controls, of course, from the outside of the camera that we're looking at here. So whether they are smooth or not would not affect the way the shutter functioned. It would just simply be undesirable from a user's point of view. We want things to move smoothly. I'm cleaning the retainer thread at the back and the thread on the inside where the rear lens group screws in. The rear lens group in this case, of course, was not overly tight. In fact, you might have said it was a bit loose. In the case here, I've got to get that all clean because everything needs to move smoothly, and we want all traces of oil and grease gone from there. Start with a nice clean case. So I'm just using naphtha, cigarette lighter fluid, Ronsonol, or in this case it's Venti, I think, or was. I've long since refilled these containers 100 times. Alright, so I'm looking closely at this to see if there's any roughness in these corrosion. You can see the staining from corrosion here on the case. I'm just making sure that it doesn't feel rough to the touch, that it wouldn't cause things to fail to move smoothly. On this inner recess here, that's where our moving plate for changing the apertures runs, so that should be nice and clean, otherwise it won't work properly. And you can see little patches of corrosion there, which will almost certainly line up with some of the dirty dots that we see on the case. Just rubbing off those big bumps with the tip of my screwdriver. Now, I'd already tested the diaphragm before I took the shutter apart, so I know that the diaphragm did move smoothly enough so that I know that these lumps and bumps were not causing a serious issue. And I just need to make sure that they never do. It looks fine, I'll clean that. You can see the usual fingerprints on here that have etched their way in over time. Skin oils and perspiration have a remarkable ability to etch into metal surfaces. It's best to hold pieces like this by the edges. If you want to get really fussy about it, you'd be using gloves or finger cots. This surface goes against the diaphragm blades. The other surface goes to the case. That looks fine. The retainer. One face of this faces the shutter blades and obviously needs to be very smooth and clean because shutter blades need to be able to swing freely and quickly. The other face goes against the diaphragm blades, which is not quite so fussy because it doesn't need to move at any particular speed. So I'm looking at the marks on here and I want to be sure that none of those are going to create a problem. There's a corrosion spot here. A small one here. And corrosion spots like that just act to make a surface less than smooth. That's fine, that'll work nicely. The diaphragm blades themselves. Well, it's a bit dirty looking. There's a few marks at that end. I don't know whether they'll clean well or not at this stage. I may have to polish those with a bit of metal polish, brasso. I dislike doing that with diaphragm blades because they're very easily damaged when you're trying to clean them, particularly because of these little rivets that they have on them that serve as the pivot points. So when you're cleaning them, it's easy to catch whatever you're using, be it a cloth or a cotton bud. It's easy to catch on those rivets and bend things up. And bending things up is a bad thing, of course. You don't want to be doing it. So I will clean one of those blades and see what it looks like. I'm just going to clean it with some naphtha. Now, instantly the video camera will react to that nice bright white surface by making sure that the diaphragm blade is black and featureless, so you'll see nothing. I'm sorry, I can't do anything about that. This camera does not allow for any manual control of the exposure in video mode. I can for stills, but not for video. It thinks it knows better than me. There's certainly some staining on those blades that is not going away. I don't think it's serious. And we have the advantage that I know the diaphragm blades moved smoothly before I took this apart. So there is little danger that it'll be rough once it's been cleaned and appropriately. It'll only be better than that. So I'm not going to polish those blades. If they're all like that one, that'll be good enough. I don't know why my tweezers are picking that up. Oh, they must have had something sticky on them. So I'll just clean these 5 diaphragm blades up, and then that diaphragm can be put back together.